Hello, my name's Finn. I'm a flight instructor in the southeast of England, and today we're going to go on a bit of a deep dive into FREDA checks or cruise checks. And well, this video is for you if you're learning to fly and your instructor keeps on asking to do a FREDA check and isn't quite happy with them, and maybe you haven't got to the bottom of why he's not happy with you, or maybe you already got your private pilot's license and you're trying to refresh your knowledge and improve your safety by making sure you don't miss anything. So this video is for you, especially if you fly an aircraft like a Cessna 172, 152 or a PA28. Those are the types these are specifically applicable to, but maybe applicable to others. Whatever you do, make sure you check with your instructor. If that's me, then no need. But if that's not me, then go just check with the instructor that you're doing the correct thing. So let's get on. And first, I really want to talk about what's the point? What is the point of doing FREDA checks? Well, really, it's a safety thing. FREDA checks are amazing places to notice things that are going wrong slowly, or to correct mistakes or slip-ups that you have made or someone else has made. So let's look into that in a bit more detail. And these have saved my bacon quite a few times. Now I'm going to use the phrase FREDA check, cruise checks quite interchangeably. But essentially, this is the check that's almost standardized in the sort of UK flight training world. And you'll come across this a lot in light aviation. So let's look at it. Why bother? So we said prevent easily preventable issues. Let's look at some examples of that. So every now and then you'll read an accident report that says the engine stopped and they landed in a field or whatever, and there was one tank that was totally full of fuel and the other one that was empty, and they'd just mismanaged their fuel system. And so FREDA check is a brilliant way to not be one of those embarrassing accident reports or embarrassing statistics where you can get distracted and forget to manage your fuel properly if you're not in a good habit of doing a FREDA check and end up in a bit of a sticky situation. So that's one thing. Carb ice is again another thing that you read a lot of accident reports for. Often someone will have landed and their engine will have suddenly stopped. They'll have landed in a field. They normally walk away from these things, and the engineer comes along, starts up the engine first time, and there's nothing wrong with it. And they say, well, what must it be? And everyone says, it must have been carb ice. So make sure you are aware of the risks and when carb ice is most likely. And some aircraft are more prone to it than others, but it can be a real incipient thing. We don't notice it happening until it's a bit too late. So there's one other good reason to do your FREDA checks. Another one, going off course. So maybe you go off course and you just get a bit lost, or maybe you go off course and you end up at one place a couple of miles east or west or north or south of where you thought you should be. That's not the end of the world. But worst case scenario, if you go off course, you can fly into areas where you don't want to be. Maybe that's controlled airspace. Maybe that's dangerous bits of airspace. Maybe that's just over an airfield where you shouldn't be because there's parachuting or something like that. So really good to ensure that your navigation is accurate is to make sure, especially if your aircraft's old, and the older the aircraft, often the more the DI drifts, is that the DI is regularly referenced to that compass and is nice and accurate, giving you good, accurate reading. So that's another reason to do a FREDA check. Another one, really easy one to do this, flying with the wrong pressure setting, especially if your airport gives QFE as well as QNH, or if the QNH is changing quite a lot over a long flight. You can quite easily end up with the wrong QNH set. Or maybe you're up in the flight levels and you're above the transition altitude and you've forgotten to set it. And you're reporting your flight level as XYZ when really you're still on an altitude. So another good reason to do a FREDA check. And another one is to really help you spot things that are going wrong, to spot them early. Some of these happen to me. Let's talk about what I've written down here. It's overheating engines. So particularly common if you're in a big prolonged climb in the summer, and if you're not keeping an eye on that temperature gauge, it can often start to creep up towards the red line. And luckily I've not really had this issue too much. These engines we fly behind are very reliable, but if you do spot an overheating engine, best to sort it out before it causes any real catastrophic problems that force your hand into doing something. And same for losing oil pressure or gaining oil pressure. If your pressure isn't in the green anymore, then you're going to need to do something. The engine's probably going to need to be looked at pretty soon, so you need to be thinking about landing. And if you hadn't spotted this early, then you have less time than you would have done before. The engine doesn't care whether you're looking or not, really. And then electrical issues. This is actually probably one of the most common ones. If you start to see your ammeter no longer charging, or some will actually show you when they're discharging. This is one that's happened to me a couple of times actually, where the alternator has failed or has tripped off for whatever reason, and you're running out of power. If you spot this nice and early, you can normally declare the situation on the radio, turn off as much electrics as you can to conserve that power, and then you can turn on the radio just at the end, so you don't have to deal with light signals or any sort of non-standard stuff. It makes it easier if you spotted this early and conserve that what battery power you do have. So, tons of great reasons for doing FREDA checks then. Let's look into what we're actually going to cover today. So we're going to cover the aims of this sort of talk are to help you memorize FREDA. I really appreciate that FREDA isn't a word in common usage until you've come into aviation. So we'll talk about how you can, just a few simple methods that you can help memorize it a little bit. Especially useful if you've not been at school and had to memorize stuff for a long time. So if that's you and you're maybe been out of school for 5 or 10 years or more, then these are some of the skills that we often lose quite quickly. So we'll talk about how to memorize it. And we'll go through what you should be checking in quite some depth. So I'm going to zoom in quite a lot. We're going to do a bit of a deep dive, if you will. But then what we're going to do is we're then going to zoom back out again at the end and talk about how you can make it nice, efficient, and flow really, really well and really quickly. This check shouldn't be a check that takes a long time, and once you've practiced it loads, you can make it quite snappy and effective. So those are the 3 big main tasks today. The overarching task is to improve everyone's flight safety is really what we're here. So, first thing we said we talk about is memorizing FREDA. Now, I come across this time and time again with the abbreviations we make flight students and private pilots remember, whether it's FREDA, whether it's Hazel, whether it's Bumfitch, whatever it is. These are used commonly in flight training, and they're supposed to help you remember a certain set of actions to do, normally also in a certain order. The order's not always as important as it may seem. I think the problem is none of those 3 examples I've just used are real words. Hazel isn't spelt like the colour hazel. FREDA is not something a word I've ever come across, and Bumfitch certainly isn't. So on first glance, it can actually be quite hard to remember because first you have to remember this whole new word. But I'm going to show you a few tricks with memory, and essentially the tricks with memory are first downloading it, so saving it into your brain, and then accessing it quite a lot. Once you use stuff quite a lot, then your brain remembers it well and knows where to find it. So what I'm going to show you today is just a few really easy ways of saving this information in your brain and using it often. And you'll find quite quickly, if you use this information quite a lot and test yourself fairly regularly in your early stages, you won't need to revisit this and it will just be memorized. So first thing and probably the easiest thing to do is if you could just pause the video now and say out loud what FREDA stands for. So you should have a list that looks something like this: fuel, radio engine, direction, and altimeter. So what I want you to do is just pause the video now and just say that out loud a couple of times. Great, thanks. So you've paused that video, you've said it out loud a couple of times, you've already sort of downloaded it to your brain a little bit. The next thing I want you to do, and what I will say at this point, if you already have no problems memorizing FREDA, just skip forward a couple of minutes. I want you to write it down. Write down what FREDA means, so fuel, radio engine, direction, and altimeter. And then I want you to cover it up and then read it out loud again. And do that a few times. And this is another really good method for memorizing things. If you write stuff down, your brain has to process it a bit more. If you then have to recall it, i.e. say it out loud where it's covered up, again, your brain's being forced to go in and remember it. Even better thing to do, cover it up, go look at something on the internet for a minute and then come back to it and try and recall it is even better, because then it's not in your short-term memory anymore. Okay, maybe you've done that and you're still having trouble memorizing FREDA. Go and get someone to test you. Maybe this is a friend, a partner, mum, dad, some sort of relation, someone at work, someone at the flight school, whoever it is. Get someone to test you. Get them to ask you, say, look, anytime today I want you to just ask me what FREDA is, and I have to tell you that it's fuel, radio, engine, direction, and altimeter. Okay, maybe this isn't working for you and you still have real problems memorizing it. Real trick to memorizing really difficult to remember things is to try and get your imagination involved. It's much easier to remember a picture or of something. In fact, when you think about things you can remember, they're often actions you've done, and you can often picture yourself doing them. You don't picture, you don't remember a paragraph of a description of what you did. You can almost imagine the image. Perhaps imagine is basically part of derives from image. So try and utilize your imagination a little bit and get that involved, and you'll find this, once you unlock this is how people memorize pi to hundreds of digits. This is how people memorize some actors memorize big scripts, tons of stuff. Really powerful technique. There's no point doing it if you've already memorized FREDA and you don't need to, but get your imagination involved. So make up a song or make up a story. You might have heard of a mind palace, so maybe have a story about you going around your house interacting with different things that remind you of different parts of the checklist. So you could go into your front door and you might find your hallways on fire because the fuel in it, you've accidentally poured lots of jet fuel over it. You think, oh, why did I do that? I was just trying to clean the floor with this excess jet fuel. And then you think, oh, right, I'm gonna have to call the fire brigade. But you haven't got your phone. You've only got this portable radio that you use at the flight club. And you find that, and you run into the living room, you find that, and you radio the flight club. And hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. If you want a bit more guidance, I really recommend this video. If you go to Google and Google TED Talk, Feats of Memory Anyone Can Do, this will help you memorize not just FREDA checklists, but tons of other stuff you may need to remember. Okay, that's memory. Hopefully that's given you some techniques you can use to memorize FREDA. Okay, so now we've memorized FREDA and what those words mean. We're going to go on a bit of a deep dive about what we should be checking, why we should be checking it, and really look at everything in quite a lot of depth. So let's head immediately to the first thing which you will be shouting at the screen is fuel. So really the whole point of checking fuel, one of the biggest things that we want to avoid is running out of fuel. So I want at any time my students to know what our fuel endurance is. And one mistake I see lots of students making is they try to do lots of maths while they're flying an aircraft. We all know that flying an aircraft kind of reduces your IQ by about 50%, it feels like. It's really hard to have the capacity to do even basic maths while you're flying and listen to the radio and listen to your instructor talk. So what I want you to do is, before you go flying, work out how much fuel is in the aircraft and then what sort of endurance that is in a time basis. When you take off, you should also be noting down your takeoff time. And then all you have to do when you're flying and you want to do your FREDA check and work out how much fuel you've got left is look at your endurance, look at when you took off, and tell me how many hours or minutes you have left. So, also one note here as well is that the gauges in your aircraft, in most light aircraft, are wildly inaccurate. Often will read totally wrong things. So really don't rely on them. Get an approximate burn for your aircraft type. Look in your POH and round it up to the nearest sort of gallon per hour. Ask your instructor what they use. As a rule of thumb, if you're using a 172, I tend to use about 6 gallons an hour, US gallons an hour. Double check with your instructor what they use. If there's a different engine in your aircraft, they might use something different. I fly a old 172H and I use about 8 gallons an hour as an approximation for that. These are all quite conservative figures. And the same for most PA28s I fly, but some PA28s have bigger engines. If you're flying something like a 182 that's got an even bigger engine still, they need a different fuel consumption. So double check with the POH and your instructor. Ask them what sort of vague fuel consumption they use. And it'll be gallons or litres per hour. Then dip the tanks on the ground before you go flying using the same, you can make sure you ideally using the same units as your fuel burn. So if you burn 6 US gallons an hour, find out how many gallons are in the tanks. Work out how much fuel endurance you have, and then just write it down at the top of your kneeboard. Just write down the hours and minutes you have of fuel endurance. And then the maths becomes very, very simple when you're doing it. So that's one thing. I want you to be saying something like, fuel, okay, I've got XYZ remaining, so 1 hour, 30 minutes remaining. Next thing on the fuel is the tanks. Some aircraft are very simple and basic. They have 1 or 2 tanks, and they just drain from both of them at the same time. For some aircraft, when you go above a certain altitude, you might not be able to drain from both anymore. You might have to swap the tanks between left and right. Some aircraft don't ever drain from both and have just can only drain from either the left or the right tanks, or there might be tip tanks as well, depending on the type. So make sure you know your POH, so Pilot's Operating Handbook for the aircraft type, and know how the fuel system works. And when we think about fuel, I want you to tell me the endurance and also what you're going to do with the fuel tanks. Do you need to do anything to keep them balanced? When's the next time you're going to switch them? Have you got a fuel pump? Do you have an electric fuel pump that needs switching on or off above a certain altitude? Or do you need to switch on before you change tanks and then off again afterwards? Do you need to double check the fuel pressures in the green as well? These are all things that are quite type specific. Double check with your instructor. If you're flying one of the most common types, for example, a PA28, you will want to think about all of these 3 things. Whereas if you're flying a nice basic 152, you'll just be thinking about the endurance. Next thing is radio. So, radio we spend a lot of time on, really, and it's a really easy way to get yourself into trouble because sometimes it's quite busy, and as an instructor I've been guilty of this where I've just needed to turn it down for a minute while I explain something. And so one thing that's really important to catch is making sure the volume's not all the way down and you're not missing any calls. Another thing that's important to catch is make sure to just remind yourself what frequency you're on, what service to expect from the air traffic controller, and a really good thing to do is also to put the next frequency in that you're going to use to save yourself a bit of time later. We call this getting ahead of the aircraft, planning ahead. So what I want you to do when you think about the radio is I want you to look at the radio, double check the frequency and say, I've got XYZ service, that's probably a basic service or a traffic service from whoever the controller is, whether it be Bryce radar or Oxford radar, whoever it may be. Then I want you to just a voice in your back in mind just to say, is the volume still up? Did we turn it down? If you didn't touch it, fine, no problem. And certainly if you can still hear transmissions on it, no problem as well. Make sure you got the next frequency in, so whatever you're going to come up next. And then now's the time to just glance down at your kneeboard, and notice I'm doing it in a very specific order. Glance down at your kneeboard, look at the last transponder code you were asked to put in, and then look at the transponder and double check that that correlates. Don't do it the other way around. Look at your kneeboard first because that's got the correct information on it. And that's all I really want you to be doing with the radio. Next thing is the engine. So one of the big things flying light piston aircraft is developing ice in the carburetors. So I want you to do a carb heat check, which should look something like this. You should check the RPM first, then apply the carb heat for at least 10 seconds. You'll notice the engine isn't running as efficiently now as the mixture changes, and we're now putting hot air into the engine. So the RPM reduces a little bit, and which means you'll hear the pitch of the engine come down. You don't even really need to check it. And then after about 10 or 15 seconds at least, put the carb heat back to cold, turn it off, and just double check that the RPM's gone back to where it was a second ago. If it's gone higher, that means there probably was some carb ice, and that's going to need a bit more further investigation. To get to advanced level of FREDA checks, a really great way of making this more efficient is to pop the carb heat on at the start of your checks. So just before you go to fuel, look at the RPM gauge, apply the carb heat, and then start with fuel, radio, engine. And then when you get to the end of engine, double check the carb heat and turn it off. That can really save a lot of time. Next thing to look at is the oil temperature. We want this to be within the green arc below the red line. This often includes it being right at the bottom, including cold. There's often no red line at the bottom. Now, double check that's okay with how your club or the owner or the maintenance organisation want you to operate the plane. Some of them might want you to warm them up first. So do double check that what I'm saying that is true, but on most types you can depart and fly along with an engine that hasn't warmed up yet. It will do very quickly. Next thing to do is, oh yes, here's a little picture of it. Here's what the PA28 gauges look like, and there you can see the oil temperature, just that's slightly higher than it would normally be, around 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Oil pressure, check that's also within the green arc. You see this one's within the green arc. If it's out to the cautionary ranges here, you can still fly quite safely in those, but it's probably time to be thinking maybe you might want to go get on the ground and have that checked out about why that's not in the green zone. So I'd probably divert somewhere fairly close for that reason. But you may find if your oil's particularly cold, especially on the ground, if it hasn't warmed up a bit, it may be slightly on the low side. So it's still quite viscous. Next thing is the suction gauge. You might be gauging something like this. This is indicating no suction, but normally you want it around the sort of 5 region. They don't all have the green marking here, but your POH will tell you exactly what suction to expect. If this fails, it's not the end of the world if you're flying VFR. You'll remember from your instrumentation that this controls, this suction powers the DI, the directional indicator, and the attitude indicator, or artificial horizon, you might also call it. So if they go, it can be quite disorientating, and if they do go, especially the attitude indicator, I recommend grabbing a bit of paper from somewhere and covering it up, because even when you can see the world outside perfectly, it can be very disorientating when it's telling you something different right in front of you. But yes, it's not the end of the world if you're VFR, but if you're IFR, then that's a fairly serious situation. It should be rectified as soon as possible. Another thing to check on the ammeter is just that the ammeter is providing positive charge, i.e. there is electricity going to the battery to charge it back up again. 2 types here. This one here we see is not charging the battery. It's down on the 0. If it was above the 0, it would be charging the battery. So this is a bit of a red flag to me. And same, this red flag here, you see the ammeter's discharging. So there's more amps coming out of the battery than going to it. So this isn't going to last long in this condition either. So both of those things to, if you spot your aircraft doing this, it's time to let someone know and to get rid of, stop using electricity. If you're flying day VFR, that's quite easy. You can literally, depending on the airspace you're flying in, turn off almost everything. And I think there is probably an argument for even turning off the beacon light, where that's one of the things you probably should still keep on. But yes, all these engine checks are about making sure you spot anything going wrong quickly and get yourself to a place of safety if something isn't going your way. Better spot it early. So that's quite a deep dive so far. In a second, in a bit, we can come back to this and show how actually it can be just quite quick because you're just noticing things. Next thing I want to talk about is the directional indicator. So first, and this is sometimes not as easy as it sounds, just fly straight and level and in balance until that compass stops moving around. Sometimes, don't forget that compass has inertia still, so after a bit of turbulence, it may still move around for sort of 10 or 20 seconds or something. And if it's not, playing ball and just have patience. Wait, fly smoothly, wait for it to settle. Sometimes in turbulent weather, this is a really, really hard task. It might not be possible. But even so, try and wait for it to settle down and then read the compass heading. Don't forget that it reads right to left. So for example, this one is, looks like it's just more than south. So probably about 183, 184 degrees. Another really important thing to mention is try and get your head in front of it, because there's quite a big distance between this line and the actual compass. So you can have what's called parallax error, where one of the lines is, if you're not viewing 2 things from front on, if that's actually over there, then that's going to read something different, even though they're right in front of each other. And don't forget, this doesn't include the 3rd digit. So even though south is, even though this is 210 degrees, they've just knocked off the last digit to make it a bit easier to read. Always read the compass first. If it's not reading right, then go down to the DI to check if it's reading right or not. If it's not, then change that. That's the DI. Fairly self-explanatory. If you've got any problems, double check that with your instructor. You'll find the older the aircraft you're flying, the more likely it is to drift off. and also it depends where you are on the globe as well as to how likely it is to drift off. But really, I find the biggest thing that affects it is the age of the aircraft. And if it's not producing quite as much suction as it used to, and if all the parts are a bit old and not as sort of free moving as they once were, you notice it drifting off a bit more. So really important, especially when you're navigating, make sure it's lined up nice and accurately, nice and often, so you can navigate well. Okay, next in our FREDA deep dive is the altimeter, right at the end. So first, look at your kneeboard for the last pressure setting you were told to enter. Probably a QNH, but maybe if you're coming near an airfield, might be a QFE. If you're not sure what QNH are and QFE, I'm going to do a video on those soon. And if you're watching this in the future, that video will be available for you, so check out my other videos. And check the altimeter, little readout is the same. And that's all you really need to do. I'd also recommend at this point just reminding yourself what altitude you're supposed to be maintaining, and make sure you are maintaining it if you're not. Time to fix that. Okay, so we've done a really big deep dive into the ins and outs of what you should be checking in a FREDA check on a sort of light piston, single engine piston aircraft. Now we're going to look at how that should actually sound and how that should look, and how you can make it nice and efficient. So first things first, we do our FREDA checks every 15 minutes ideally, okay? And you know what I'd say as well? Every 15 minutes, or if you're bored. If you ever find yourself bored, really good thing to do to see if there's anything you've missed and to try and get ahead of the aircraft is just do your FREDA checks. So it should sound something like this. If you close your eyes and imagine you're in the cockpit flying along, it should sound something like this. Okay, so FREDA checks, fuel. I've got 1 hour, 40 minutes of fuel remaining. If I'm in a PA28, this will be, I'm currently using the left tank. I swapped over 15 minutes ago. In another 15 minutes, I'm going to swap to the right tank. Pressure's in the green. I'm above 1,000 feet above the ground, so I don't need the electric pump. That's all. Radio. Currently, I'm listening to Farnborough East. I've got a basic service. The volume's still up. I'm squawking 0430, and the next frequency I'm going to call is Headcorn Radio 1. I can't remember the Headcorn radio frequency. Then engine. T's and P's, they're in the green. Ammeter's charging. Suction's in the green. Carb heat check. So I'm now going to notice the RPM. Pull the carb heat on. Give it about 10 seconds. Here's a little cheat. You can make this even more efficient by doing this at the start. So before you go to the fuel, check the RPM. Apply the carb heat to hot. And then continue as we were. And then when you get to this bit, you just need to turn the carb heat off and double check it's gone back to where it was before. Then DI, so have a look at the DI, make sure I'm flying straight and level, nice and smoothly. And the DI says 235 degrees, look down at my DI. Oh, that needs adjusting slightly, push that in, 235, brilliant. And then altimeter, we were told to use the QNH, the London QNH of, maybe it was 1020. Double check, that's in the altimeter. I said I'd be maintaining 2,200 feet, and I am. Isn't everything going well? So that's a FREDA check. Should sound and look pretty much exactly like that. That took, less than a minute, and that will stop you running out of fuel. That will stop you getting lost because your DI isn't aligned. That will help you notice any abnormal things earlier than you normally would have done. And if you've got a PPL test to do, this is one of the things you'll be expected to be doing. You'll be expected to FREDA check fairly regularly, and if you're flying somewhere with an instructor, they'll expect you to do the same thing as well. So really, if you're an instructor out there and you're watching this video, hello, thanks for watching. I really recommend introducing this in the early lessons. Start introducing these FREDA checks when you teach your students to fly straight and level. If you're a student that's flying straight and level and you've not been taught this, try and really show off to your instructor. By next time there's a boring little moment when you're flying along, say, Mr. Instructor or Ms. Instructor, I'm just going to do a little quick FREDA check. And here it goes. Show off to them. They will love it. So look, thanks for watching that video. If you've got any questions about FREDA checks, comment down below. I'll try and get back to you, or email me, flywithfinn@gmail.com. And look, I really hope that this has helped your confidence in learning the FREDA check, in making it more snappy, more efficient, and helping you make sure you don't miss anything. So look, enjoy your flying out there and stay safe. Thanks.